Welcome everybody. Those of you who have kind of just joined, I'm sure the numbers will be going up as we go through the session. We are recording this as well, and we will make the presentations available from the session as well. We are collecting questions for this through Slido, so the QR code is up there at the moment. Please do join up. I say just with the volume of people on the session, it's helpful for us just to be able to manage them. But there's lots of really interesting questions already being posted up. So, and do take the opportunity in there just to uppost things as well. And in true democratic style, things that are a bit closer to the top of likes, we'll try and focus on as well. So, Gav, can I just move on to the next screen? Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, great. Yeah, so my name's Steve Barker. We've got over 600 people booked onto the call today, which is great. And that's very much in line with what we've got with the other deep dive sessions that we've got going on as well, and the overview sessions actually as well. So lots of interest. We are in a webinar mode, so you won't have access to kind of cameras and microphones, and the chat function should be off. We are going to focus on taking the questions via the Slido, so please do that link. And if you, we will bring the link up again later on in the presentation, but you should have access to that via the invite that was emailed, that was sent out with the invite up. As I mentioned, please do upvote questions. We'll try and have a look at some of the more popular ones. We are going to try to focus the questions, though, that we look at around the topic areas that we are going to cover today. There are other sessions that are going on around some of the other specific areas, and we'll be, and we will share obviously recordings from those and presentations from those as well. So. But everything that you post up gets sent to MHCLG. So even if we don't get a chance to cover things, they will get shared, and they are looked at, I promise you, and they are really useful as well, just to help MHCLG in their move forward. We've got quite a lot to get through. We're looking at the kind of 4 topic areas, looking at kind of town centres, the effective economy, healthy communities and sustainable transport, looking through the chapters. So we will be leaving the Slido open as well after the event until about the 4th of Feb, so opportunity just to kind of post things in. But what I will say, and I'm sure I'll repeat this again later on, is this does, putting comments in here and questions in here does not negate the idea that you have to respond to the consultation. Please do take the time to respond to the consultation. The aim of these sessions is to help you to get a bit of clarity on things that are noted within the draft consultation, but also to help MHCLG be kind of ready for the understanding of the comments and things that are coming on. Next slide, please, Gareth. So my name's Steve Barker. I'm really pleased that we've been joined by Josh Lawson, Amy Brooks, and Christina Davey from MHCLG. They've kind of made the time to sort of cover sort of different areas within the session. Next slide, please, Gareth. Yeah, and that's the order we're just going to go through. So we're going to have a little bit. Josh is going to do a little bit of an overview and of the draft NPPF, and then he's going to move on into the looking at the ensuring vitality of town centres. And then Amy is going to cover the building strong and effective economy and promoting healthy communities. And then Christina is going to go through the promoting sustainable transport. We're then going to go through some of the questions in Slido and give some of the answers there, and then kind of wrap up the session. I promise we'll be done before 12 o'clock. I say we have got a fair bit to get through, and we'll see. So as you go, there's the Slido question. That's the QR code there on the screen for accessing the Slido. So please do so, and please do post things up on there as we go. Okay, brilliant. I'm just going to bring Josh up onto the screen, if that's okay.
Thanks,
morning,
Steve.
Josh.
Good morning. Thanks for having us. Great to be here. Great that so many people are still coming along and interested in all of these events. So we're going to do sort of a session of 2 halves here today. The first will be a bit of a recap of that overview session that happened previously. So apologies if some of you have seen this before, but hopefully there's a nugget or 2 in there that you may have missed. And then, as Steve said, we'll move on to a deeper dive into these topic areas. Steve suggested that we all do like a Christmas NPPF update. And while we do, we are hoping that this is the last big one for a while. And that's why it's really important for us to get as much information and feedback on all of these policy changes as possible through this consultation. So we really do welcome views. Could I have the next slide, please? So first and foremost, why are we changing the NPPF? NPPF has changed a number of times, most recently in December 2024 to align with the priorities of the new government. This is not the first government to suggest that the NPPF needs to be clearer. And it's not the first or the start of the conversation around making the NPPF more rules-based. There's been a number of proposals over the last few years in the ways that we can improve the NPPF, including work through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act to create a set of national decision-making policies. And so lots of thinking has been done in this space, and all of that thinking has infused where we've got to with this consultation. There are a number of really, really important objectives which lie behind the consultation, and they're set out here for you to see. The first of which is we acknowledge that the NPPF can be expressed more clearly. We want those policies to be readable and accessible and understandable for all users of the planning system, maybe more akin to the way that they would be in development plans. It's really important that we try to make national policy more rules-based, improving consistency and predictability, so that when applicants or decision makers are reviewing applications, they understand a little bit more what they are looking to do and deliver. The third thing that we've looked to do here is make policy more comprehensive. The NPPF as it currently stands, it doesn't cover all aspects of development management, and there are particular gaps here that we've wanted to fill. The aim of doing that is to avoid plan duplication, and so we've attempted to cover the most common issues that are creeping up across local plans to have a sort of unified position countrywide. But that says we recognise the need for local discretion. The final thing I would say is that this NPPF is about maximising opportunities to further support growth across different sectors. Growth is a central mission for this government, and whilst the changes we made in 2024 went some way to supporting that objective, the updates we've made here are much more comprehensive, and we've done this in a way that we hope delivers on that growth agenda, but whilst maintaining that vital balance with environmental protections. Next slide, please. So what are the principles for these changes? I think it's really important to say up front that lots of the content here should be familiar. We have tried to maintain the essence of most existing policy, certainly not started with a blank sheet of paper. And ministers were very keen that we didn't tear the book up. So lots of the policies that you see should be familiar, albeit rewritten or drafted in a way that fits with this more rules-based, clearer approach to policy. It's been really important for us in doing this that we distinguish decision-making or development management policies to those about plan-making. Currently, the NPPF talks simultaneously about both of those things, and that in part was to do with keeping the document short and concise. But often that results in policy not being as clear presentationally and can be quite challenging to interpret. So we've grappled with that, and we now have this distinction between decision making and plan making. As I alluded to on the previous slide, we're filling gaps here, but again, very much recognise that there is still room for local discretion and local policies. So we have attempted to set out and tackle the big issues where we are plugging those gaps. And then the final thing, just to reflect on slightly further, is we have made changes here that reflect the new legislative landscape and takes on board aspects of both the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act and the recent Planning and Infrastructure Act. And we've taken those together with the new framework for local plans in mind. Yeah, great. Next slide, please. So the big changes, there's lots of them. These are the biggest of the big, maybe you would say. And I've already talked a little bit about decision and plan making policies and splitting up chapters in that way. There was a world, and we did give some consideration to splitting out all plan making policies and all decision making policies. And that was a very deliberate decision. As you will have seen from reviewing the document, we have kept the style of topic-based chapters. So you can see all of the policies pertaining to a particular area in one place. But we do ask a question about that in that consultation. Is this a right approach for a new NPPF? And we're very open to views on that. We have reordered some of the chapters, as you will see, and there are indeed some new chapters. And this has been very much done to give emphasis and focus on some of those critical issues which maybe didn't quite have as much of that previously. So this includes climate change, flood risk, energy and water, and public protection all now have their own unique chapter. A simpler presumption. This is a big change, and I would encourage you to go to the sessions that grapple with the presumption and indeed development inside and outside settlements for more detail. But this is a new way that we are approaching national policy in a way that the NPPF to date hasn't really gone into in terms of how it grapples with the kinds of development in particular locations. We do this a little bit with the green belt, but this is a more comprehensive approach to how development should be considered both inside and outside settlements. And the final thing to say here is there are some additional annexes which have been introduced and lifted predominantly from where they sit currently in guidance. And we've done this to help operationalise policy within the planning landscape and more so. We've been quite selective in those annexes and really focused on bringing in those bits of guidance which are key to the operation of the NPPF. So that includes things like your standard method for housing need, flood risk, and grey belt identification. Next slide, please. Presentationally, there's lots of changes. So beyond the split and the sort of policy format we've discussed, we have revised the introduction to be clearer on the intent of policy and the use for which we are setting out. When it comes to plan and decision-making procedural policies, they both retain a chapter each, but have been substantially revised, particularly the plan-making policies, to reflect the new plan-making framework. You will see now that each section has an upfront objective, and they aren't policies in themselves, but the intent of those objectives is about setting the context out for what we expect the policies within each chapter to be doing at a high level, and that will hopefully help with some of the interpretation of those policies. Numbering has been a continuous issue in terms of paragraph chapters for the NPPF and all of its updates for some time. So we have a new approach to our numbering system. There's no longer the consecutive numbering, and this should make it much easier for decision makers and anyone trying to refer to the NPPF to refer to the correct part whenever there is a small tweak or change. We very much intend to assimilate footnotes in a kind of similar manner to help improve clarity and readability. And we're still considering the best way to do that, so views welcome. And the final thing we're looking to do presentationally is bring the NPPF up to modern standards, even more so, and make it as digitally friendly as possible, so you can quickly navigate to the parts that you want without control-Fing your PDF. Next slide, please. So although this is an overview session, I think good to just quickly cover the plan making and decision making procedural policy chapters briefly. The plan making chapter, as I've mentioned, is very much geared around the new plan making system. And it's trying here to set out expectations for people working on different plan types around things like how plans should be examined, what you need to do if you're working on a certain plan in a way that goes above and beyond the legislation currently set out. We've been very clear in the plan making chapter around non-duplication of policies within the NPPF, and we are very clear that plans should focus on local issues such as things around site allocation, designation and local requirements, and those kinds of policy matters, rather than trying to go beyond what we say in the NPPF or even repeat. And the final thing to mention on plan making is the introduction of a policy on local quantitative standards. And we've done this to try and reduce the amount of variation that we see in local standards and streamline and restrict where those standards can be set to the most important issues. Finally, on decision-making policies, there is a heavy emphasis, much more so than currently, on the proportionality of pre-applications and information requirements. And with those information requirements, we're looking to bring more consistency on those for development proposals. DM3 is name checked here because this is about the overall approach to handling planning applications and very much consolidates messages in the current framework about making decisions in a positive manner. You will have noticed there's quite a lot more on viability in this NPPF, and indeed in the consultation there is a whole annex on viability. And so we've done a lot to set out how viability should be considered and the limited circumstances in which it should be assessed in terms of site-specific matters at the decision-making stage. The final thing we've done in the plan-making policies is consider, or better set out, our expectations for relationships between the planning regime and other regulatory regimes. Very much based on case law, one needs to assume that those other regimes are operational, and if there are material considerations on matters concerned by those regimes, they very much need to be accounted for in decision making. Next slide, please. So hopefully that's the end of the stuff we've already seen. I'll now talk through town centres and go into a bit more detail on each of the policies set out in the town centre chapter. So we have 4 policies in the town centre chapter, 1 plan making policy and 1 decision making policy. And I think the important thing to say overall, which is set out in the objective, is our town centre policies very much continue to focus on the vitality and viability of our town centres. The approach taken here has been to encourage both plan makers and decision makers to consider how we are encouraging diversification of use of town centre spaces and how we are thinking about the optimisation and maximisation of land use and intensification of that use. And that theme is prevalent, I think, throughout all of these plan making policies. So if we look at TC1, TC1 very much pulls in what is currently paragraph 90 and 94. And there's this, as I mentioned, great push for diversification of town centre uses. Another common theme throughout all of these policies is this kind of increased name check for residential, the incorporation of residential use within our town centres being really important for delivering on this government's priorities around housing. We are more explicit in TC1 on consolidation and intensification of centres, as I've mentioned. And another change here, which is different from the current NPPF, is around site allocations. No longer do we have the sort of slightly arbitrary look 10 years ahead in terms of site allocations, but we have brought this in line with the applicable plan period to hopefully give plan makers more flexibility when it comes to considering site allocations. The other thing here to say is we have lifted across some elements of PPG, and in particular, we now name check design guides, design codes, and potential use of Article 4 directions where appropriate to encourage plan makers to consider how they might best utilize these kinds of tools to deliver vibrant high streets. TC2 is a brand new policy, which is very exciting. But again, the sort of intent behind this is really focusing on that vitality and vibrancy of the high street. And what we are proposing is to give substantial weight to development proposals that support town centre viability, vitality, and improve access to local shops and other facilities that provide day-to-day services for communities. So real note here that consideration of how does said proposal benefit the local community and how are our town centres delivering for local communities is really important to note here. Next slide, please. TC3, slightly more familiarity maybe with TC3, which is about main town centre uses outside of town centres and considers the sequential test. Very much where in the consultation we have asked the most detailed question with regards to town centres. The policy itself sets out the sequential test as it is now, and very much seeks views on its retention and its usefulness in a world post implementation of use class E. We're really keen to understand what, if any, is the impact of use class E on the effectiveness of the sequential test, and is there still a place for the sequential test in this policy landscape? So really keen to get views on that. We've also brought in further elements of PPG to TC3, which are around form and scale of proposed developments. We might have been slightly light touch in the consultation document on this, but our intent here is to very much, as I say, reflect what is already set out in guidance that decision makers should be considering if a proposal can be adapted to make work within the existing town centre. And that ties back into this point around consolidation and intensification of use of our town centres, minimising vacant sites and those principles. And then finally, we have TC4. So TC4 is about assessing the impact of development on town centres of out-of-town centre developments, so retail and leisure. The intent of TC4 is as it currently is in the current NPPF, and it very much remains appropriate for us to be considering that impact of large out-of-town development on town centres. This is an and test, not an or test, so both parts of the impact test need to be met and considered when we're considering it. There is an error here that I must point out in the consultation document, which we are updating imminently. And the consultation document implies that we are changing TC4 to no longer be a pass-fail for development proposals. That's an error. That is not true. The intent is very much that, as currently, if upon carrying out an impact assessment, that impact is deemed to be too significant and have too significant effect to a town centre, that development should be refused, and that remains the case. We are aware of this. We are updating both the consultation document imminently, as I said, and we will be contacting anyone who's already provided a response to give them opportunity to consider that. It's important to note that the NPPF itself is correct. The text in the NPPF is right, and that is the intent. But the consultation document has this oversight. So that will hopefully bring some clarity to any questions there. I will stop talking now and hopefully pass over to Amy.
Thanks, Josh. That's it's really helpful kind of run through there around time sensors. And there's a few questions kind of coming into the Slido, which we'll have a peruse through and kind of come back to afterwards. Amy, over to you to take us for a stroll through the sort of the effective economy section. And then I think you're also going to do the healthy community section as well after that.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. And good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many people online. I am Amy Brooks and I work at MHCLG as Deputy Head of Planning Policy. So work on both the kind of coordination of the NPPF and also we'll be talking through the economy and healthy communities chapter this morning. So I'm going to start with the economy. And this is an area that we already made some changes to in the December 2024 update to the NPPF. And as Josh mentioned, economic growth is a really important area for this government, and it's an area that they are genuinely interested in where we can go further to support business growth and support the economy more generally. So with our economy chapter, this is in the draft NPPF at chapter 7, building a strong, effective economy, and it builds on chapter 6 of the current NPPF. We've proposed 4 policies in this chapter. The first 2, I'd say, are kind of like general policies in relation to economic growth, and then we have 2 more specific policies. So the first is E1, and that is a plan making policy on providing the conditions for long-term economic growth. This is very much based on paragraphs 86 and 87 of the existing framework, retains those expectations that plans need to set a clear economic vision and strategy for their local area. And it also kind of sets out expectations on seeking to address potential barriers to investment. So things like addressing kind of poor environment or poor infrastructure. And it also sets expectation on the allocation of sites. Now, building on the existing NPPF policy, that already includes some references to specific business uses. We're proposing some additions there to reflect kind of new and expanding sectors. So we've included in the policy some references to last mile deliveries, campus facilities, and leisure and tourism. We've also included some references to some of our kind of key government strategies. So we have references in there to industrial strategy zones and AI growth zones, and kind of other references that are in the existing framework are also being carried across. So that includes things like data centres and grid connections. One change that I think it's important to note is in the second half of the policy. So that's E12. And that sets out that where development plans are allocating sites, they shouldn't be overly prescriptive about what uses are acceptable on particular sites. And this is because we know that kind of business needs and commercial property demands do constantly change. So it's important that plans are flexible. And we know that kind of the flexibility is required even within plan periods. And then moving on to E2, this is then our decision-making policy. And this is a new policy. So intention is to provide clarity on relevant planning considerations for business development proposals. We are proposing that substantial weight is given to the economic benefits of proposals for commercial development. And then in the case of farm and agricultural modernisation proposals, that substantial weight is given to domestic food production, animal welfare, and the environment. The second half of the policy at E22 also sets out some specific factors that decision makers should take into account when they're establishing if there is an unmet need for kind of certain business uses and sectors. And that includes things like market signals and the locational requirements of certain uses. So those are what I would describe as our more general economic policies in plan making and decision making terms. And if we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. We then have 2 further policies. Now, the first is E3, and this is specific to freight and logistics. We're proposing that we have a freight and logistics specific policy because we know that this type of development often has quite specific locational requirements. There's often kind of particular transport impacts to consider, and they often relate to development that includes large buildings and large structures. So in the policy, we are setting out some key planning considerations. So those are having good access to transport networks, ensuring that siting and design limits environmental impacts, and that it limits impacts on local residents or other neighbouring uses, and that proposals provide sufficient and secure parking. Lastly, in our economy chapter, we have E4. This again is a decision-making policy. And this is kind of more of a redraft of paragraph 88 and 89 of the existing paragraph with some changes. So it retains the approach set out in the current framework to kind of encourage and support certain types of development in rural areas, with a stronger focus through some additional wording on a few kind of forms of farm development and diversification. And then wording that's currently in the NPPF on rural community facilities isn't in the current NPPF because we've moved it to the Healthy Communities chapter. So it's just elsewhere in the framework rather than in the economy policies. And the second half of the policy, which is E42, is we're aiming to be clearer there on development outside settlements. So partly to be clearer in general terms, but also to align it more closely to our new policies on development inside and outside settlements. So trying to set out more clearly that where development may be more suitable outside of settlements, it should take opportunities where they exist to use previously developed land or sites that are physically well related to existing development. So those are our 4 economy policies. If we can move on now, I will cover our Healthy Communities chapter. Thank you. So the Healthy Communities chapter is set out in chapter 16 of our draft NPPF out for consultation. And there are a couple of overarching things I think it's important to flag for the policies in this chapter before I get into them. The first is that it is predominantly based on chapter 8 of the current NPPF, which is called Promoting Healthy and Safe Communities. And you may have spotted in this NPPF the safe is missing, and that is because it's been moved into our new chapter on pollution, public protection and security. We also have 2 new definitions in the glossary, and these are quite important to the underpin this chapter. So these glossary definitions are in Annex B, and they relate to public service infrastructure and community facilities. And broadly, public service infrastructure is things we consider that are provided by higher tiers of government, so central government, local government, that either serve a local area, so something like a library, or they cover a broader kind of district-wide area, so a hospital or a healthcare facility or criminal justice facility. And then community facilities, broadly, we mean things that serve a local community and that they are often provided by a parish group or a community group or provided by local businesses. And the intention with these glossary definitions is to provide more clarity on what we mean and then use those to underpin some of our policies, which I will run through now. Next slide, please. So the first is HC1, and this is our plan making policy for the Healthy Communities chapter, and it consolidates a lot of existing policy, which is set out in the NPPF, a number of paragraphs. And one particular thing to note, which is different, is that we are setting expectations that plans should set local standards on outdoor recreational space, drawing upon kind of best practice and relevant national standards. And we've added this as a proposal because we want plans to set out their expected levels of provision very clearly, so that they are delivered and that kind of developer contributions can be secured. And then within the policy as well, you can see we have references to community facilities and public service infrastructure. So ensuring that local plans or development plans have a good understanding of the deficits in the area. They have an understanding of anticipated demands that may come from new development. And then they also kind of allocate land specifically and set out expectations from developer contributions. Engagement is also heavily referenced in this policy and throughout this chapter, both in relation to local authorities engaging with service providers to think strategically about needs across their area, but also engaging with local communities to understand the facilities that they kind of want and need. Moving on to the next slide, please. Now, I have skipped HC2 for now. I'm not doing them quite in order, but all policies will be covered at some point. So jumping to HC3 and HC4, these are both decision-making policies, and they are based on existing NPPF, so paragraphs 100 and 101. And in HC3, we're trying to be clearer about the need for new community facilities and public service infrastructure, where new development could have a significant impact on people needing services. So this could be through kind of new homes or also through new employment. It's just generally where kind of we know that kind of new infrastructure may be required. So in this policy, we reference that planning conditions and obligations should be used to secure public service infrastructure and community facilities serving new development. And this policy, HC3, also has a link back to HC1, so using those standards that have been set in the plan to demonstrate kind of levels of provision. And then on to HC4, this is about proposals for new or improved public service infrastructure and community facilities. And again, in this policy, lots of reference to engagement, so encouraging engagement between authorities, developers, service providers, both kind of before applications are submitted and during the kind of planning phase. And we're also proposing that some new expectations on authorities to engage with local communities, so that includes families and children, in the design of play facilities. And we're proposing that because we want to make sure that new play facilities are kind of reflective of user needs and that they are diverse and inclusive. The policy is also proposing to give substantial weight to the benefits of providing new or improved public service infrastructure and community facilities. So that's giving those facilities and infrastructure some real kind of strong policy support. So those are the policies that are most specific to our kind of definitions on facilities and infrastructure. And then next slide, please. We then have policies on retaining existing as well. So HC6 is specific to community facilities and public service infrastructure, and HC7 is specific to recreational facilities. HC6 is a new policy, and it's aiming to provide clarity on the considerations that should be taken into account if a key facility may be lost. So the policy states that proposals shouldn't be lost unless there is going to be a replacement or it's demonstrated that the facility cannot come back into use. So that could be on viability grounds, or if it can be demonstrated that there's kind of no longer community support or the community no longer require it. Now, we are proposing that this policy would only apply to facilities which are the last of their type in an area. And this is a policy that we are particularly interested in views on. We are trying to reflect an approach that we know is kind of commonplace across local plans, and we're trying to strike a balance between providing that important safeguard against the loss of facilities, but making sure the policy isn't overly and unnecessarily restrictive. And then on HC7, similar principle, but in relation to open space, sport and recreational facilities. And this policy is in the current framework, but we are proposing some changes. So we're proposing that this policy is extended, so the safeguards also apply to other formal and informal play space and allotments. We're also proposing a change to one of the criteria, which is provided on the second sub-bullet of this slide. So we are proposing that at present, we say in the NPPF that any loss should be replaced with equivalent or better provision in terms of both quantity and quality. And we are proposing to amend this to quantity and/or quality. And the intention here of the and/or is to provide some flexibility, because we recognise that sometimes an improvement in quality can offset a reduction in quantity. So the intention is not to see a kind of overall net reduction, but we know that an increase in quality can sometimes offset quantity. So that is an area that we are kind of particularly interested in views on through the consultation, as we are with every policy. So next slide, please. And then moving away from public service infrastructure and community facilities, which I feel like I've said about 100 times. This chapter also covers some other matters, more specific matters. So HC5 restates paragraph 97 of the existing framework in relation to hot food takeaways and fast food outlets. So proposals, this is what the policy says, that proposals should be refused where they are within a reasonable walking distance of schools and locations, either where children congregate or where there is already a concentration of uses. And there are a couple of points to note in this policy through the consultation that we are seeking views on. We are proposing one small tweak, that it should be within reasonable walking distance of a school rather than walking distance. And we're doing that to try and reduce ambiguity, to demonstrate what area this should broadly apply to. And we are also very interested in the term fast food outlets and how it applies in planning decisions. So we are welcoming views in the consultation on kind of ways in which we can provide clarity on the establishments it should apply to, and also kind of interest in feedback more generally from different local authorities on how the fast food outlet term and this policy has been working in your areas. Next slide, please. And then to finish the Healthy Communities chapter, I just wanted to outline the two policies we have relating to local green space. So jumping back to HC2, which I did promise I'd cover, this is a plan making policy on local green space. So this relates to their designation through the development plan. And then we have HC8, which is the decision making policy for development affecting local green space. And we are proposing a couple of small changes to these policies. The first on HC2 is to specify that rather than being reasonably close, which is what the existing NPPF said, to change that to close. And that's because we want to reinforce that local green space should be genuinely local and should genuinely be kind of accessible and serve local communities. And then on HC8, we're proposing a small clarification that whilst any proposals affecting local green space should be considered in the same way as Greenbelt proposals, this does not apply to policy for Greybelt or previously developed land in Greenbelt. And that is because we wouldn't expect local green space to be Greybelt or to be previously developed land. So that's just a clarificatory point in the policy. So that is my kind of summary of the economy and health communities chapter. And I'll now hand over to Christina. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Amy. That's great. Yeah, thanks for kind of going through those bits for us. Christina, over to you, I think, for the sustainable transport section.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Stephen. And good morning, everyone. Just to introduce myself before I get going, my name's Christina Davey. I'm the Head of Planning Policy for Sustainable Development and the Environment, which means my team is responsible for various chapters in the NPPF, including promoting sustainable transport. So let's dive into promoting sustainable transport, which is set out in Chapter 15 of the consultation NPPF, and this builds on Chapter 9 of the current framework. First of all, it's worth saying that much of the revised chapter is intended to restate existing transport policy in clearer terms, while removing certain plan-making expectations where these matters can be addressed adequately through the national decision-making policies. So I will just now run you through the main changes that we're proposing. So starting off with what we have presented as one of the 12 key changes in the framework, which is to further embed a vision-led approach to transport planning. So just as a bit of background to this, the concept of a vision-led approach to transport planning was introduced to the framework as part of the December 2024 revision. And what is a vision-led approach to transport, you may well ask, and I can see there's been a number of questions on this in the Slido. So this is an approach based on setting outcomes for development to achieve well-designed, sustainable, inclusive and popular places, and providing the transport solutions to deliver those outcomes, as opposed to predicting future demand to provide capacity, which is often referred to as the predict and provide approach. And we know that this can create unattractive environments which are dominated by cars. So this approach focuses on the transport outcomes that are desired and planning to achieve those. So in terms of how we're proposing to embed this approach further, we're proposing to embed it both through our plan making and decision making policies. And we're doing this by, first of all, introducing new policy to policy TR1 on early engagement in plan making to promote a vision-led approach. And then secondly, we are making clear that development proposals should take into account the vision for the site and reflect the principles in TR3 to ensure that development is located in sustainable locations. And policy TR3 is the proposed decision-making policy on locating development in sustainable locations. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a further change which we're proposing, which also applies across both plan making and decision making, is the introduction to policy of the connectivity tool. So the tool was published in June last year and provides a national metric of connectivity to measure what a sustainable location is for development in transport terms. So in terms of how the tool works, it generates a connectivity score to measure people's ability to get to where they want and need to go using sustainable transport modes such as walking, cycling and public transport. And we are therefore proposing to include reference to the tool in our policies to emphasise the important role that it can play to inform the assessment and selection of sites for development in both plan making and also when assessing development proposals. And we've included a web link there on the slide, but if you Google the connectivity tool, it's really easy to find for anyone who would like to take a closer look at the tool. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on to local parking standards, which is the second of our plan making policies. Now, this policy draws together elements of the current framework on parking standards, but so that policies are clear, it clearly sets out that development plans are required to set local parking standards rather than simply suggesting that this is an option. It also introduces a more permissive approach to maximum parking standards, removing the requirement for a clear and compelling justification where such standards support sustainable transport, optimise development densities in accessible locations, or manage the local road networks. And then finally, additional policy wording here clarifies that standards should allow flexibility through ranges where that is appropriate and address specific business requirements. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on to sustainable locations and assessing impacts, where we are proposing a number of changes. So for decision making, the term significant development, which is currently used in paragraph 110 of the existing framework, we are proposing to replace this with a significant amount of movement in the context of the area within which they would be situated. And I appreciate that that is a bit longer, it's more words, but this is to provide greater clarity about the type of impact with which this is concerned. So, for example, it is quite possible to have a significant development which does not create significant transport movements. So our intention here is that this policy is much clearer that this is about the scale of movement from the development rather than just the scale of the development itself. And linked to this change is a proposed change to the plan making policy TR1, which proposes that plans may set thresholds for what constitutes a significant amount of movement in new development, where this could support the application of proposed policies in TR3 and TR6. This change therefore allows LPAs to consider what a significant amount of movement means in their local context, and establish a threshold to assist with the implementation of the decision-making policies. And then finally, just on the significant amounts of movement points, we are proposing to revise where the current NPPF paragraph 118 states that all developments that will generate significant amounts of movement to proposals likely to generate significant amount of movement. Those need to be supported by a transport statement or assessment and also a travel plan. And this change is proposed to reflect the fact that impacts will not be fully considered until those documents have been prepared. And then finally, on this slide, in relation to how adverse impacts should be considered, we have provided much clearer language to the policy here, and also broadened the policy to reflect the potential impacts on the transport network as a whole, rather than just highways impacts. Next slide, please. Okay, so we are also proposing some changes in relation to roadside facilities and also marine ports, airports and other aviation facilities. So starting off with roadside facilities, this policy revises the current framework to provide clearer guidance on roadside facilities. It clarifies circumstances where new, significantly expanded or upgraded facilities should be approved, and states that the loss of the facility should not be supported unless compensatory provision with good access to the strategic transport network is likely to be provided, or the facility is demonstrably no longer needed or viable. So there's some criteria there set out, the circumstances where that could be allowed. And then moving on to ports, airports and other aviation facilities, this policy revises parts of the current framework and converts some plan making policy in the current framework into a decision making policy, and it also introduces new provisions to support proposals that modernise facilities, enable the transition to low carbon fuels, maintain airfields, public service roles, and also demonstrate acceptable environmental effects in relation to a range of different factors, as is set out there on the slide. Okay, on to the final transport slide, thank you. So just to finish up, we wanted to flag the changes that we're proposing in relation to our policy on street design, access and parking, and then also public rights of way. So starting with street design, access and parking, this policy redrafts parts of the current framework to create a more cohesive approach to transport considerations in the design of schemes. It also includes new provisions for incorporating facilities that prioritise sustainable transport, and adds explicit references to meeting the needs of older people, children and people with disabilities. This policy also directs users to national design guidance, so including the Manual for Streets and also the design and placemaking planning practice guidance. And then finally, on our public rights of way policy, this builds on the current framework, paragraph 105, to provide additional guidance on extending rights of way network where suitable opportunities exist, and this policy also acknowledges that diversions may be acceptable where they maintain or enhance the overall route network. Next slide, please. Okay, so that is the end of our policy presentations. Thank you so much for listening in. I hope you found the presentation's informative, clarified a few things and answered some questions for you. Just in terms of the consultation itself, so it is open for 12 weeks and closes on the 10th of March. So we are sort of nearly midway through that now. There's a link there where responses can be submitted. Please do submit your responses. We're really keen to hear your views and opinions of the policies that we've proposed. Yeah, and I will hand back to Stephen to start the Q&A session.
Brilliant.